the video. Well, it turns out that the ego attaches itself to this concept that sin is a foundational idea in the ego's thought system, in its teaching and belief system. And in this case, sin has the meaning of, in the darkest meaning you might imagine, is the way the ego tends to view that. And so this becomes a permanently, heavily defended dogma within the ego's teaching systems. And you can, of course, recognize how that was perpetuated in many societies and in belief systems throughout time. Well, that relates to our topic for this evening, which is taken from chapter 19, sin versus error. We're going to make a distinction between what the ego calls sin and what the Course calls error. Welcome to Miracles on High Plains. My name is Jonica, and our reader for this session is Julie.
It is essential that error not be confused with sin, and it is this distinction that makes salvation possible. For error can be corrected, and the wrong made right, but sin, were it possible, would be irreversible. The belief in sin is necessarily based on the firm conviction that minds, not bodies, can attack, and thus the mind is guilty and will forever so remain unless a mind not part of it can give it absolution. Sin calls for punishment as error for correction, and the belief that punishment is correction is clearly insane. Sin is not an error, for sin entails an arrogance which the idea of error lacks. To sin would be to violate reality and to succeed. Sin is the proclamation that attack is real and guilt is justified. It assumes the Son of God is guilty and has thus succeeded in losing his innocence and making himself what God created not. Thus is creation seen as not eternal, and the will of God open to opposition and defeat. Sin is the grand illusion underlying all the ego's grandiosity, for by it God himself is changed and rendered incomplete.
Mm-hmm. So, two very different concepts. Sin belonging to the ego is part of the grand illusion, and it is foundational to the ego's assertion of the separation from God. It has connotations in the ego's teachings that it is unforgivable, that it is permanent, and that punishment is warranted, justified. It's that guilt is fundamental. So all of this becomes part of a worldview that the ego teaches, that we are separate from God, and sin is the main device that keeps us separate from God. This has been perpetuated in many belief systems throughout time, and you all are familiar with that. In contrast, error is a teaching that is consistent with this course, and it is essential that error not be confused with the idea of sin. And error is simply a mistake. Someone says 3 times 3 is 8, and that's a mistake, and it can be corrected. There's no judgment about the person's morality or their worthiness or their lovability. It was simply a mistake, and it can be corrected. Very different concepts. And we're going to spend not only in this section, but also the next section is also going to dwell on this concept of the ego's view of sin so as to dislodge it from your mind so that you recognize that it is so prominent and so widely held and yet means nothing. It's a part of a delusional teaching system, part of the ego's arrogance. And so we need to recognize the problem so it can be solved and know that some people, while you may free yourself at times from the idea of sin, other people may believe that you are a sinner. And so, in order to understand their confusion, we have to recognize our own confusion, and then realize that none of this is really meaningful, that these are simply mistakes that confused minds make. Julie?
The Son of God can be mistaken. He can deceive himself. He can even turn the power of his mind against himself. But he cannot sin. There is nothing he can do that would really change his reality in any way, nor make him really guilty. That is what sin would do, for such is its purpose. Yet for all the wild insanity inherent in the whole idea of sin, it is impossible. For the wages of sin is death, and how can the immortal die? A major tenet in the ego's insane religion is that sin is not error but truth, and it is innocence that would deceive. Purity is seen as arrogance, and the acceptance of the self as sinful is perceived as holiness. And it is this doctrine that replaces the reality of the Son of God as his Father created him and willed that he be forever. Is this humility? Or is it rather an attempt to wrest creation away from truth and keep it separate?
Mm-hmm. They're making a direct reference here to many of the religions of the world. A major tenet in the ego's insane religion is that sin is truth, and believing that innocence is a lie, a deception, and that purity, the idea of being holy, which this course teaches, is viewed from their point of view as arrogant. So, can you see how it's completely upside down, completely opposite? And you're likely to meet people that are of that persuasion. And we want to recognize the pain and confusion that underlies that belief system so that our hearts open to anyone that is weighed down by this belief in sin. And so it calls into the question all the ideas of holiness. Those would be viewed not only is arrogant, but perhaps is, what's the word, blasphemous, or even contemptible. And so these are doctrines that replace the reality, the holiness of the Son of God and his Father. These are alternative teaching systems offered by the ego. And as we know, they have been adopted by and incorporated into these various tenets in world religions.
Any attempt, excuse me, any attempt to reinterpret sin as error is always indefensible to the ego. The idea of sin is wholly sacrosanct to its thought system and quite unapproachable except with reverence and awe. It is the most holy concept in the ego system, lovely and powerful, wholly true, and necessarily protected with every defense at its disposal. For here lies its best defense, which all the others serve. Here is its armor, its protection, and the fundamental purpose of the special relationship in its interpretation.
Hmm. Wow, that's really, can you see how this is like a foundation of that thought system? It's the idea, it's the mistaken idea of sin is wholly sacrosanct to its thought system, and any attempt to question it um, would is it's going to respond defensively and assert, oftentimes by quoting passages from their holy books, assuring us that sin is real. This is the one thing that will be defended the most, the best defense. And then before the entirety of the thought system is pinned to this one concept of because we're sinners, we're separate from God. And so many of you probably have encountered this and already know that this is the case. What we're doing here is pointing out how this serves as an anchor for the ego's thought system and how strongly protected it is by those who advocate for that thought system. And so in A Course in Miracles, there's a major undoing here. Undoing the belief in sin. Oh my goodness, that's like undoing thousands of years of religious tradition. Now, to the Holy Spirit, it's simply a mistake. It's this. There's nothing organic that needs to change. The light is still within the hearts of every soul, but there is this barrier of belief, and that's why the Course works with undoing beliefs because they serve as barriers. And so we've been given the ability to change our minds. And I know I'm for those of you that are listening to this have already decided to change your mind. But for those that are still yet to approach this program or some other program that calls Sin into Protection, know that this is a belief that is armored and protected and is considered fundamental to all relationships. And I'm fond of pointing out, at least within the Christian tradition, I'm familiar, perhaps it's Catholic tradition, after a baby is born, for centuries of time, a very large number of children died before the age of 5. Almost 40% of children died before the age of 5. And so, what they do in the Catholic tradition is they want to christen that baby early on in case it dies. They want its soul to be saved because they believe that if it's not christened, it's born in sin. And well, then that's not so good, huh? If it should die. So these are, again, these are fundamental to the concept of our very nature. And this is all a deeply held, dark mistake. You're
It can indeed be said the ego made its world on sin. Only in such a world could everything be upside down. This is the strange illusion that makes the clouds of guilt seem heavy and impenetrable. The solidness that this world's foundation seems to have is found in this. For sin has changed creation from an idea of God to an ideal the ego wants, a world it rules, made up of bodies, mindless and capable of complete corruption and decay. If this is a mistake, it can be undone easily by truth. Any mistake can be corrected if truth be left to judge it. But if the mistake is given the status of truth, to what can it be brought? The holiness of sin is kept in place by just this strange device. As truth, it is inviolate, and everything is brought to it for judgment. As a mistake, it must be brought to truth. It is impossible to have faith in sin, for sin is faithlessness. Yet it is possible to have faith that a mistake can be corrected.
Yeah, so there was a lot there said there, and we want to go through this. Um, First of all, just reemphasizing that an entire worldview is built upon this idea of mankind as sinful, as separate from God. The solidness of, that this world's foundation seems to have is found in this. And so any, you would say this is a central idea in the ego's thought system. Sin and its companion guilt are the core idea of the ego. And the Course acknowledges this is a mistake and it can easily be undone by truth, as any mistake can be corrected if it's brought into the light of truth. That's a if. But here's where the ego goes wrong, and that is if the mistake is thought to be the truth. If sin is thought to be the truth, so to speak, religious truth, then what do we do? Then the idea of sin is kept in place and unquestionable. It's inviolate, and everything is brought to the idea of sin for judgment. For in other words, the whole thought system now revolves around, is that sinful or not? Everything is brought to sin, to it for judgment, and then that perpetuates the idea that it's up to us to be the judges. So further errors perpetuate, and then we go looking for identifying the guilt in other. That's why the woman that wore the scarlet letter walked around with her mark there, is because she had been judged by the society and had to display that. So you can see that the error really is not to have believed in sin, but to believe that that is the truth, and that is some kind of holy divine teaching about sin, means that the person feels completely justified in their thought system, and it goes unquestioned throughout their entire belief system. Um, and yet, despite that, it can be corrected if a person is willing to let go of their prerogative of judgment, if a person is willing to question those truths. So I've seen many individuals do just this, where they were raised in a very rigid, traditional religious thought system. I'm thinking now of the Amish and the Mennonites in the United States, where, and there are many others. I'm not just picking on them, where the children are raised under this very heavy teaching system, and then they grow up and decide to question these things. One of the things they don't like these children to do is go off to college, where they start learning to ask all these questions, because they noticed that those children tend to leave the faith, because they realized that it was a mistaken belief. Even though they may love their parents and their neighbors, they no longer subscribe to that belief as the truth. And in many ways, that's what this program is doing, is causing us, inviting you to question some long held beliefs in your own mind and realize that they are not true. And once you're willing to do that, then forgiveness becomes possible. Forgiveness, to forgive is to give forth an idea, or to give it over a long held belief that you thought was true, but now are questioning.
There is no stone in all the ego's embattled citadel that is more heavily defended than the idea that sin is real, the natural expression of what the Son of God has made himself to be and what he is. To the ego, this is no mistake, for this is its reality. This is the truth from which escape will always be impossible. This is his past, his present, and his future. For he has somehow managed to corrupt his father and change his mind completely. Mourn then the death of God, whom sin has killed. And this would be the ego's wish, which in its madness it believes it has accomplished.
Mm-hmm. So, two ideas I want to point out to you. One, to the egos, in the ego's temple of beliefs, this is the most heavily defended idea, that there's a reality to sin. And so this is a foreshadow of the next section, where we will look at the and examine from Holy Spirit's point of view the idea of, is it a reality? And I would like you to keep your minds open to the possibility that somewhere in your own mind you believe that sin really is a reality, that you too have been indoctrinated by this worldview. And while you may not consciously subscribe to it, you, with pressed in certain situations, you would confess that yes, that is unforgivable. And so we'll examine that idea about the reality of sin more closely in the next section. But until then, let's expose what is the ego's motivation here. His motivation is to get you to believe the following: that God is dead, that you have somehow managed to corrupt the Father and to change the Father's mind completely, and therefore you should mourn the death of God, whom sin has killed. Meaning, if God is love, then if sin is real, then that doesn't that say that God's love is not real? I mean, you can either have one, the reality can be based on one or the other. A completely loving, benevolent creator that spreads love throughout all of creation, or the idea that the opposite is true. This is yet another example of what we talked about in the previous section, where the Holy Spirit wants us to discern between ideas that are meaningless, such as sin, and those ideas that are meaningful, such as love, to distinguish between what we've been taught without, and we didn't even question, and what our heart and soul aligns to and brings life to our understanding. For the ego would have you believe in the death of God and the victory of sin over life and love. This is the ego's wish. And the ego believes it has accomplished it. Didn't we read earlier where this is its arrogance is on display in this idea of sin? We'll go on. Julie, there you go.
Would you not rather that all this be nothing more than a mistake, entirely correctable, and so easily escaped from that its whole correction is like walking through a mist into the sun? For that is all it is. Perhaps you would be tempted to agree with the ego that it is far better to be sinful than mistaken. Yet think you carefully before you allow yourself to make this choice. Approach it not lightly, for it is the choice of hell or heaven.
Yeah, it's the choice of hell or heaven, because if you want to believe in the sin as the foundation of all of the world, then that is consistent with a belief that life is hell. If you want to believe that love is the foundation of all creation, then that is consistent with the belief that life is heaven. You really have a choice. It's which perceptual system you want to be guided by? And then which one do you want to practice? I want to go on into the next section because there's a few paragraphs in the very next section that build right on this, and we have a little bit of time here.
The attraction of guilt is found in sin, not error. Sin will be repeated because of this attraction. Fear can become so acute that the sin is denied the acting out. But while the guilt remains attractive, the mind will suffer and not let go of the idea of sin. For guilt still calls to it, and the mind hears it and yearns for it, making itself a willing captive to its sick appeal. Sin is an idea of evil that cannot be corrected, and yet will be forever desirable. As an essential part of what the ego thinks you are, you will always want it. And only an avenger with a mind unlike your own could stamp it out through fear.
Mm-hmm. So, one way in which it says, as an essential part of what the ego thinks you are, you will always want it. An example of that is if you believe in it, you'll go looking for it in the world, and you'll go looking, using your own judgment for examples of other people who are violating the taboos, violating the things that are permitted, and identify, well, there's most certainly an example of sin, and you'll wind up convincing yourself, in fact, that your belief in a world of sin is true. It turns out it's equally true if you go looking for examples of love. If you become love's messengers, then you will find examples of that, and it will reinforce your belief in that. So I'm going to do a little summary here, laying the two concepts side by side, where one is a world view of sin, where as we said, it's its foundation, and the inevitable outcome of sin is punishment. And that can be in the most severe forms. Pay attention to how it feels. How's it feel to think of yourself or another as being sinful? In contrast, all that, now we flip to the other side with the idea that these are simply mistakes that we've made. These are beliefs in the mind that are ancient beliefs and that simply call for correction. And that's part of the plan of atonement. And all of a sudden, when that feeling of sin lifts, the feeling then that replaces it is one of being light and being free. And they use the metaphor of walking through a mist or a cloud when the cloud clears. So I was going to remind you all about the assignment to send me an email. I believe everybody that's attending here has already heard this already. But if you are doing the workbook lessons on a daily basis, you'll encounter workbook lesson 13 very shortly. But even if not, I would ask you at least this one sentence. And I do this for a reason. This is not just exercise to keep you busy. It's so that the meaning and the importance of this statement might seep deep into your understanding. Send me an email explaining. Some of you already have. Thank you. Others, please, in the next 10 days, send a copy to me. That was a short section there. Honestly, not my favorite topic, not full of hope and holy relationships and everything, but let me recognize the problem so that it can be solved. And the notion that somewhere embedded in your memory, not perhaps practice in your conscious mind, there may still lodge a number of ideas about unforgivable sin, and that those ideas act as obstacles. And later on in the next section, we'll look at the question, well, who made the judgment that those behaviors are sin? Who was it that judged? Who is it that judges a behavior or action or a statement as sin? And we'll realize that once we examine this under the light of truth, it like all other illusions, it falls apart. So that's as far as we're going to go. Thank you all for your attention. After we read the next section, which is on the reality of sin, that's when we begin the obstacles to peace. And I really encourage you to attend those sections. I think those four obstacles are the most profound psychospiritual journey that anyone can take. And it'll summarize many of the ideas that we have covered earlier in this chapter. So thank you all. Julie, thank you for reading. Thank you all for your attendance. We look forward to seeing you again real soon. Remember, it's just a mistake.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank
Jonica.
you, Julie. Thank you,
You're
Jonica.
welcome. You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you, Jonica. Thank you. These are big sections. I'm really glad you're here to so we can go through this, because it is. I've had a couple of nights where that terror thing came up,